Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. We are going to be looking at Exodus, and specifically the first half of Exodus this morning. If you can hear me all right, I know there's a few people watching. Just let me know. If you can't hear me, let me know. Exodus chapter 1 through... Oh, there we go. Now I got all my electronic devices working here. Exodus chapters 1 through 18. And Exodus is different than what's going on in Genesis. In Genesis, I mentioned it a little bit in the Bible class this morning. There's a lot of language that's used that is very un-Hebrew. Joseph, and Jacob also, Joseph, especially though at the end of Genesis, is embalmed. He's mummified. And he's placed in a coffin. Hebrews didn't use coffins. And there's a lot of mixing in with the local culture, with Joseph especially, because he's a primary figure in Egypt at this point. And so when we get to Exodus, there's a definite change in tone. There's a recentering. There's a reorientation of the promised land onto the promised land and to Canaan, rather than what Abraham's family has only known for the last 400 years, right? Because they've only known Egypt for the last 400 years. Even the language that's used in our text this morning of this first half of Exodus is going to begin to change, right? We begin to see Pharaoh called the king of Egypt now. Instead of just Pharaoh, he's the king of Egypt. And that's a very Hebrew way of saying things. That's not an Egyptian way of saying things. Joseph is no longer referred to as being embalmed or even being in a coffin. Joseph is referred to his bones being carried back with them to the promised land. And so these are distinctly Hebrew terms that begin to be used now as a new identity begins to be formed of a family turning into a nation now, a people. And so the first part of Exodus recounts how Abraham and his family become enslaved in Egypt, right? And this is a promise that God makes them. In Genesis chapter 15, he promises to make them a great nation, and we always remember that, right? But Genesis chapter 15, and I think it was 13 and 14, and God said to Abraham, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve. And afterward, they will come out with many possessions." So God we're at the point where they're trying to come out of this nation now in the story, and God is going to raise up a deliverer for them to confront the evil Pharaoh and to liberate the Israelites, right? So God rescuing the enslaved and the oppressed people, at the same time he's defeating the gods of Egypt. And that's going to be a major theme that we're looking at this morning, is the defeat of the Egyptian gods. And so from Egypt, they set out into the wilderness on their way to the desert of Horeb or Mount Sinai, or there's a couple other names that are used for it. And there's a ton of symbolism here, right? Egypt is sort of symbolized by water. There's, of course, the Nile Delta. There is the Mediterranean Sea. There is the Nile itself. And this represents plenty, right? There was lots of food grown along the Nile. And where does God send them, though? Into the wilderness, into the desert. And this sort of represents reliance on God. It also represents a lack of water, a lack of Egyptianness. They were going to be a new people, a different people. And so Moses is sort of introduced. I mentioned it in the class. Moses is introduced sort of as this new Noah figure, right? He passes through the waters of death like a new Noah, right? There was an ark of reeds, and it was covered with tar and pitch. It says in Exodus chapter 2, verse 1 through 3. And then later, he passes through the Red Sea. In chapter 3, we meet Moses at a burning bush. And the bush merges these images that we see in Genesis of the tree of life and the fire of God's presence into one image, right? The story of Moses and the tree here and the story of Moses and his life links back to Abraham and Isaac, right? When God called Abraham twice and Abraham responded, "Here am I." In this moment here at the burning bush, all the themes of Genesis sort of overlap. Themes from the garden, from Eden, from Noah, from Abraham, they all overlap into this one new deliverer character that is Moses. And so let's look at some other parallels there that happen in Genesis. You can see I've color-coded them here. These are actually the same Hebrew words, and so they have a very similar meaning of what's going on. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28, God gives a promise to them. He says, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it." Again, he makes another promise, I don't have it on the slide, to Abraham in chapter 12 and chapter 15, that he's going to make them a great nation, right? They're going to be as numerous as the sands on the seashore. In Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7, we see that promise coming to a fulfillment. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So God is remaining faithful to this promise to Abraham, and the family becomes this tribe. Well, they kind of already were when they came. They were 70 people, so that's a pretty big family. And it's all as a result of God's blessing. God responds to their cries then of slavery and oppression because of his promise to Abraham. And so God is going to raise Moses as Israel's deliverer and sends Moses in the name of the God of Abraham, right? Who was going to fulfill the promises that were made to Abraham, right? In chapters 5 and 6, we find out that God is going to promise action and that he's going to do something about it. He's going to stretch out his hand in chapter 7, he says. And so the God of Abraham is going to fulfill the promises that he made to Abraham. And this is a theme, right? This is a theme that shows up. And another theme that's going to show up is Pharaoh as this archetypal bad guy, right? He's going to resist God, and he's going to oppress the people. And Pharaoh's oppression of Israel is politically motivated. It's a political policy of economic exploitation, right? Not only does he have them already enslaved making bricks, but he's going to say, well, I don't even want to cut the straw. You need to start cutting the straw. And so he increases their burdens there in chapter 5. So this is economic exploitation, and it gets even worse because we find that the reason for that economic exploitation in chapter 1. In chapter 1, and starting in verse 8, right after we find out in verse 7, the verse I quoted, that the sons of Israel were fruitful, increased greatly. Keep reading. Now a new king arose over Egypt. That's Hebrew language, because he wasn't a king, he was Pharaoh. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and in the event of war, they also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. So not only is this economic exploitation, but this is going to turn into an ethnic and racial cleansing. This is going to turn into genocide. And we've already seen from the garden stories, from the garden narrative, from the flood, from the Tower of Babel, God does not tolerate injustice indefinitely. And the reason he doesn't is because he doesn't want his creation destroyed. And I know that sounds backwards, because what about Noah and the flood? He destroyed the creation. Well, he kept them from destroying themselves by creating a new version of them through Noah. So God doesn't tolerate injustice indefinitely. And with the increase now of Israel's population, there's a palpable rise in the tension of the story that's going on. And so then we move into the stories of the plagues. There's this tension that's rising, and Moses asks that they be let go only for 3 days, only to go 3 days' journey into the wilderness. So if they went 3 days into the wilderness, they spent a day or two worshiping and then came back, they might have been gone a week. But that's not what happened, of course, right? And these plagues happen over, we're not sure how long they happen over, but a good guess could be 9 months. It could be years, but a good guess would be 9 months, because if we take Passover, that happens generally in April, and then we work backwards, we find out that all of these plagues happen in a sequence that is generally a natural sequence of events. So Passover happens in April, and if we count backwards, the barley and flax ripens in January, then the Nile floods in July. So if we start normally and work our way forward, there's floods in the Nile in July and August, and then later on, the barley and the flax is going to ripen in January, and then later on in April is the Passover. So it's my supposition that these things happened over the course of about 9 months. In chapter 12 and verse 12 of Exodus here, let me just read that real quick. Chapter 12 and verse 12 says, "For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." So God was executing judgment on the gods of Egypt. One of the main physical representations of God in Egypt was Pharaoh himself. And so a lot of commentators over the time periods have tried to associate certain gods of Egyptian mythology, of what's called the Egyptian pantheon, with the plagues. And there is some validity to this, and I'm going to get into this in the next slide. But we need to remember, in the official writings of the Egyptians, Pharaoh was said to be divine. And pharaohs were constantly depicted as in the company of the deities of the Egyptian pantheon. And so living kings were equated with Horus here on the far right. They were equated with this god Horus, or they were often called the son of Horus, or the son of many different male deities like Osiris on the far left, or Ra there, the sun god, second from the right. And so the king's divine status, right, that was the explanation for his role as the representative to the gods. And so Pharaoh formed this link between the divine and the human realm. it's for that reason that we have to think that the plagues themselves are primarily being targeted towards Pharaoh as a god and as a representative of the gods, God's little g, right? Let's look at the next slide here. So the 10 plagues are acts of divine justice of God meant to compel Pharaoh to humble himself to let Israel go free, right? And they come in 3 cycles of 3 plagues. I have the first 3 here. And then there's one final judgment at the end. So there's 3 sets of 3, that's 9. And then there's one final judgment at the end. And so Pharaoh's response to each of the plagues is key to us understanding the reason for the plagues, right? After the first plague, Pharaoh would not even listen to the request of Israel's release, right? Chapter 7 and verse 22 is what that's all about. He wouldn't even listen to that request. But verse 22 says, "But the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said." We're going to get into Pharaoh's heart being hardened here in the next couple slides. But let's keep going. He wouldn't even listen to them. In the second plague, the frogs, he agreed to let the people go if the frogs were taken away. And in the third, he refused to listen to even his own magicians and soothsayers' advice. When the gnats come, there's a real change in what goes on with the soothsayers and the magicians. In chapter 8, towards the end of the chapter, or the middle of the chapter, during the plagues of the insects, when the magicians could not, in verse 18, they could not, so there were gnats on man and beasts. Then the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. There's a real change here in Pharaoh's heart. Before, he was able to listen, but now he's not even going to listen to them. He's not even going to listen to his own advisors. In the second set of plagues, we have the flies, the plague on the livestock dying, and the boils. In response to the fourth plague here, the flies, he suggests that Israel should sacrifice in the land of Egypt. But he's going to later let them go, just not very far. But then he reneges on even that promise, right? And in the fifth and sixth plagues, we see him straight up refusing their request. He doesn't even listen to them. And after the seventh, he promises to let them go, but then he backs down again. So we see the tension is increasing and increasing and increasing. The pressure on Pharaoh is ratcheting up. This hail happens, and there's a real change made again in the third cycle of judgments. Right? In the eighth plague, Pharaoh offers to only let the men go, and he even admits his own sin. And in the ninth, he says the men and women and children can go, but not the animals. But after the 10th, he actually urges them to go, right? In Psalm 78 and Psalm 105 mention these things, and they say that these events are evidences of God's power and God's care. So these plagues are not a divine judgment on something that God forced Pharaoh to do. You see how that would be unjust. And we're going to talk about that here on the next slide, because we often ask if Pharaoh had the free will to let the people go, or if he was forced to do the things that God had for him to do. What about Pharaoh's hard heart, right? As we read on through and I have all the plagues listed again, and all of the times Pharaoh's heart became hard, as we read on, we see this fascinating pattern emerge. In the first 5 plagues that God sent on Egypt, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart happens by his own will. Or it's ambiguous in the text. In the last 5 plagues, though, the pattern changes. So why does the author use this sort of back and forth technique, right, in describing Pharaoh's heart? Well, and like I said in the class, it's all part of this brilliant diagnosis of the human condition, right? The story is acting like a doctor, and it's telling us what's going on in our own hearts. The mysterious nature of human evil is what's being diagnosed here. God called Pharaoh to humble himself and acknowledge that God is his authority, is the authority over Pharaoh, and that he cannot redefine good and evil on Egyptian terms. That's what God is telling Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's response, though, is to say, okay, but not really. I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. And so after this, God gives Pharaoh 5 opportunities to repent and humble himself, and 5 times Pharaoh, hardens his heart. The author wants us to see that even the most heinous and absurd forms of human evil are not a threat to God's purpose. God can steer even this kind of evil towards his own plan to bless humanity through Abraham's family. So God used Pharaoh and his evil nature to our benefit. And ultimately, the evil of Pharaoh's heart is turned back onto himself, resulting not only in his own death, but an empire-wide catastrophe, right? So let's look at one of the other major stories in the narrative here, and that is the Passover. The Passover sort of accomplishes a purpose in Israel's redemption, right? It tells us what's going on through the sacrificial substitute, that is the spotless lamb, right? So God has obligated himself, through his promise to Abraham, has obligated himself to not destroy Israel when they sin against him. Right? And this is the basic explanation of what sacrifice is and how it works. So that brings us then to an alternative way of dealing with Israel's sin other than just obliterating them off the map, right? It's a symbolic ritual. This animal sacrifice is a symbolic ritual that takes up this practice that was practiced by the nations around them already, animal sacrifice, and it transforms its meaning, right? They needed a system that could do some of what I think of as 4 main things. They needed to turn away from sin. They needed to repay the debt. And they needed to provide a way to cleanse and purify the filth of the community, or that the filth that the community had caused, specifically in the house of God, which is going to be the tabernacle a little later on, but specifically in the Passover instance, it's in the people themselves. And they needed to ensure that God maintains his presence with his people. For the Israelites, it's a graphic representation, right? And I mean graphic sort of in a dual purpose sense there, right? Because cutting the animal's throat and watching it bleed out of its life is draining from its body. It's that symbol that is a very visceral symbol of the devastating results of sin and selfishness, right? These are high stakes. This is high stakes. Human evil releases death out into the world. This is the whole story of what Genesis is, right? The whole first half of Genesis. This animal's symbolic death, then, is that physical reminder of what is really at stake. That the life or death of the community is on the line. And you could call this part of the symbol that deterrent, that was turning away from sin. Number one. Number two is to provide a repayment for the hard cost of that sin. So we have turning away, repayment of the sin, providing a way to cleanse and purify the community, and then ensuring God maintains his presence with the people. And I clicked the button and it didn't go. Give me 1 second. Sometimes it does this. There we go. So, number two, the repayment of the debt. The life of the lamb, or it says you could take a goat there in, I forgot what chapter it was now. When they're, give me 1 second, I'll find it. Pharaoh, Exodus, feasts. Here we go. Chapter 12, when they're taking of the Passover, an unblemished male must be a year old. You must take it from the sheep or from the goats. There in verse 5, chapter 12, verse 5. So this life is offered as this sort of substitution. If sin, and I really like this word, if sin vandalizes God's world with death and pain, God has every right to make people face the consequences as justice. And so this animal's life is symbolically an offering as a ransom payment that would cover their sin. And the word cover, we went over this in the class, but the word cover is the literal meaning of the word kofir or kofir, which is later going to be translated by the first English translators as atonement or at-one-ment. This is the repayment. And it's the same word that's used for ark. When Moses covers the ark, he kofirs the ark with tar and pitch. It's the same word that's used for Moses' ark, Moses' basket. It's covered, it's kofired with tar and pitch. So that covering went even further though, right? Because the Israelites also saw the blood of that animal as the life. It's symbolic of the life of that animal itself, right? Leviticus 17:11. The life is in the blood. And since that blood represents the life or the opposite of death, it's sprinkling around the tabernacle can symbolically wash the tabernacle and the temple of death, right? Death is that natural result of sin and defilement, of vandalizing. And so the end result of all of this is that God's presence stays squarely in the middle of the people of Israel. Because if they didn't have God's presence, we would end up with another flood or another Tower of Babel or another, terrible thing happening. So that substitute is not offered by humans that are hoping to appease some sort of angry deity, right? That's not the picture that's given to us, right? The picture that's given to us by the Apostle John, the person who actually walked with Christ, who learned from his teachings, who grew up celebrating the Passover, who witnessed Christ's horrible death on the cross. And he wrote a letter, and he told us about atonement and about getting right with God. And the one I'm referring to is 1 John. And there's nothing about an angry deity waiting with a big stick to wipe us out. It's exactly the opposite, right? In Isaac's story in Exodus, in Leviticus, the substitute is always provided by God himself. And so the symbolism of animal sacrifice in the Bible is this sort of absolute expression of God's justice and grace at the same time. And Jesus is going to use this Passover meal as a way of explaining his impending death to his followers, right? Let me just read a little bit of that in Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7. I'm still in chapter 8. Let's try 7. Oh, that's probably why I'm not there. 22 and verse 7. Got to look at my notes. Luke 22 and verse 7. Then came the first day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And he sent to Peter and John, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat." And they said to him, "Where do you want us to prepare it?" And so he's going to explain what the symbolism of these things mean. He earnestly desires to eat the Passover with them before he suffers. Because in verse 16 he says, "For I say to you, I shall never again eat it until it's fulfilled in the kingdom of God." And when he had taken the cup and bread and given thanks, he said, "Take and share this among you. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now until the kingdom of God comes." And when he had taken some bread and given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them and said, "This is my body, which is given to you for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The body that is given for you. It is the sacrificial lamb that is given for us. And in the same way, after dinner, he took the cup and said, "This is the cup which is poured out for you. This is the new covenant in my blood." Blood represents life. This covenant that he's making with us represents life for us. It's the opposite of death. Since that blood represents life, you can see how they would want to sprinkle it around the tabernacle or the temple and as a sort of detergent or bleach to kill and wipe away all these sins. It's going to wash the temple or the tabernacle of death. Right? The end result of that is that God's presence stays with them. So this new image then is Jesus as the Passover lamb is used everywhere in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians and in Revelation it's used. And so to kind of bring all these things together, the first half of Exodus here, God offers many choices or many chances to let the Israelites go. He brings the plagues that show his power over all of creation and Egypt's feeble gods. And I didn't put it in there, but I have a handout if you want to look at some of the correlations between the Egyptian gods and the plagues. They're pretty uncanny. The Egyptians had thousands of gods, so you could pick out any of them and they kind of overlapped. But the point is that God is more powerful than they were and overcame them even to their face when he had their priests and soothsayers and different things trying to stop these things. So God offers them many chances to let the Israelites go, but he has to bring in these plagues to show his power over the Egyptian gods. And so the Passover here is the introduction of the Passover is going to accomplish several things here. It's going to be a physical reminder of Israel's redemption through the offering of a sacrificial substitute, a spotless lamb, right? It's a festival. They're supposed to eat this thing with their belt on and their staff in their hand because they're supposed to be ready to go. Ready to go where? They hadn't been let go yet. Well, we're going to find out later that it's the Red Sea crossing, and God works this mighty miracle, and Israel worships God for his deliverance. After they get through the Red Sea, they worship God, and they sing the first song of worship in the Bible here. And they sing and they look forward to the promised land, the land that had been promised to Abraham. And they wander around the wilderness for a while, and once they're free, God's people begin to grumble and to complain about their situation, and they show their own hard hearts towards the God who delivered them. And of course we say, well, I would never do that. I would never act like that, right? But at the moment that you start to think that you would never behave like these Israelites, the story has accomplished its purpose, right? You didn't realize that in reality, these stories are holding up a mirror to the person who reads them. They show us our own faults. Remember, I've said this the last 3 or 4 weeks in a row, the Bible is not a handbook, a behavioral handbook that we need to pick up and do what these people are doing. That's not it at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite in Exodus. Their complaints are reasonable, right? They're thirsty, they have no food, but their rebellious response is not. And so it's going to foreshadow the struggle that's going to come for the next 40 years as they wander around the desert, as they're doomed to wander around the desert until that first generation dies off. And for the next year, they're going to be camped out at Mount Sinai. And the next 20 chapters of Exodus, all of Leviticus, until we get to Numbers chapter 10, is all about this next year in the life of Israel. And the importance of the laws to Israel and their identity it really can't be understated. The reason that there are so many laws and the reason that they're so important to Israel's existence and identity is critical in understanding how God interacts with his people. And we're going to look at that next Sunday as we start the laws in the second half of Exodus. Specifically, I'm going to focus a lot on Sinai. And this is another time when we often think, man, those crazy, dumb people, why did they do that? They're sitting in front of a mountain that is on fire and is smoking and is rumbling. They hear the voice of God, and they go and make a calf because they're tired of waiting for Moses, and they decide they're gonna go back. At the moment you think that you're not one of those people, the story has worked its purpose, because really, if we look in our own lives, it's a mirror. And so this morning, if you want to make the commitment to follow Christ and look into that mirror and see your own reflection and how filthy it is and how it needs to be cleansed by the blood of Christ, and so that you can have the life that is in that blood, please let us know, and we can help you with those things. You can contact us at sitkachurch@gmail.com, or you can look us up at Sitka Church on Facebook. Either one of those works for us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. Have a good morning.